Okay then, so giving it 5 minutes for everybody, so I think it's time we should get started. So to introduce myself, my name is Tim Hurst. I come from the National Instruments UK office where I work in technical sales. And today I want to talk to you all about user interfaces. So before we get started, hands up everybody who's ever developed software or been part of a team developing software where you've, okay, and then keep those hands up if you've ever developed software that's been let down or you feel like the user interface was subpar. Okay, and then hands up again who wants to improve their user interface designs for future and who's really interested in good and attractive user interfaces. Okay, and then keep those hands up if you're an expert in user interface design. Okay, so we know some people that we can ask questions to at the end then. So I'm not an expert in user interface design. My background's actually in physics and programming scripts in Python really before then moving into LabVIEW when I joined National Instruments. But user interface design is something that's really interested me while I've been working in LabVIEW, especially after sitting the LabVIEW core courses. I think it's something that's really beneficial to start to get a grasp of. So some of the things today you may have heard of before, but hopefully some of the things we're going to cover will be new to you and be interesting and give you insight and then also inspiration for your own designs. So what we're going to cover is a really quick introduction. Then we're going to go through some of the basic theory behind user interface design. Then we're going to summarize that theory into 3 simple rules that you can keep in mind as you're designing user interfaces. Before then going on towards the end of the presentation, looking into some of the modern trends in user interface design, and also taking a look at some examples in LabVIEW alongside that. So my question to you is, what makes an effective user interface? So at the very basic element of user interface, we're allowing the user to interact with our software or routine. But what's the difference to make it effective? So does anybody have any thoughts in the audience?
Keep it simple.
Keep it simple.
Graphs or images?
Yeah, have images and graphs and icons in there. So what does a user interface need to do to be effective?
Display relevant information.
Yeah, definitely.
Be intuitive, with your naming conventions.
Be intuitive, definitely. So that's a really important point. So I think some of the big elements are, yeah, definitely this intuitivity. So a user interface, it's going to show the user what they're interested in. It's going to give them options to control the software. But if you can make a user interface that's intuitive, then your users are going to pick up proficiency in your software really quickly. They're going to be able to quickly learn it, and then also it's never going to confuse them later down the line when they're maybe using it for a long time. The other aspect of a user interface is if it's attractive. If you have an attractive user interface, that's going to give a really good first impression to people using your software. And if this is commercial software, this could be the difference between somebody buying it or not. If it's software that you're giving to an internal customer, then this is going to shape their impression of that software and maybe even impact whether they would call your development a success or not. And then at the end, your user interface could be really intertwined with your user's day-to-day job. They could be using your UI from anything from a couple of minutes an hour to many hours a day. And if your UI is going to be, confusing, unintuitive, and hard work to use, that's really going to impact their day. So if you can make one that's intuitive, easy to learn, makes sense, and guides them through their process, then you're really going to help them in their day-to-day job. So next, I want to go through some of the theory that builds up user interface design. So there's 3 main building blocks that I want to talk about: organization, economy, and then communication. And then we'll take a little bit of a deeper look into some of these as well as we go along. So organization, at the very basic level, is just putting some deliberation into the way that you place your elements on your user interface. So if we take an example, look at the diagram on the left, you can see one where there's really been not any thought put into that. From my time in applications engineering, dealing with customers and supporting them, when I opened up a user interface like that, I knew that the block diagram was always going to be even worse. Now, LabVIEW is really helpful because it gives us these tools really simple and easy right there on the toolbar. We've got align, redistribute, resize, and then reorder. And using these tools, you can really quickly take something that looks like the image on the right and turn it into the one we've got on the left. Well, I said that backwards, haven't I? The one on the left and turn it into the one on the right. But organization goes a little bit deeper than this. So the first thing that we can start talking about is the layout and then the navigation of your user interface. So the first tip that I found with layout is to try and build a grid structure to then fit your elements into that. And what I've seen recommended is maybe a 5x5 to a 7x7 grid structure that you can then build your elements up within. And the 5x5 is pretty interesting. So is anyone in here a musician, know how to read music? So the musical stave is 5 lines, right? So when a human looks at 5 copies of an object, that's the highest number where we can instantly recognize how many there are. If I said, okay, how many rows of seats are there in here? You'd have to manually count it. Now, if you have 5 lines, that means you've got 7 spaces either side of those lines. So I think that ties into where those 7x7 or 5x5 comes in. Any more than that, and it's going to start to get a little bit hard to look at, and maybe a little bit more confusing for the user, a little bit more jumbled. So in doing something like that, you start to straight away create a more simple user interface. Now, if we take a look at the image, we've got these kind of almost this separation of objects around the edge and objects in the center. So this may be your main point of focus in the center, and then some options or tools around the edge of the screen. So having this kind of layout where you might have options or tools that you need repeatedly, you can then start to build this standardization, this standard structure to your pages, your windows, or your tabs within your user interface. Through doing that, you create a very fluid navigation for the user, a fluid experience as they move around your UI. And it also helps increase that proficiency because they're not lost looking for different objects at different times. You see this done very well in the Microsoft Office suite, where you go around PowerPoint, Excel, Word, and all of them have their toolbars laid out in a very similar way. So if you've used one of the Microsoft products, you can very quickly take your expertise and you know where to get to the file or to the design tab of another one. And then another thing that Microsoft Office does really well is the relationships. So you want to group related objects together on the user interface to help your users navigate around. So for example, you have the file menu in Microsoft Office, and in there that's everything you need to do within saving, creating, copying new files. So in that same way, if you apply that thought to the user interfaces for your programs, you can again help create a very easy environment for the users to learn how to use it. So with navigation next, on every page of your user interface, there's going to be one main thing that your user needs to look at. And that should always be the initial focus. That should take center stage for that page on the UI. So in here we can see we've taken some of those grid elements and built them up into larger sections and larger views. So these would be the main focus of this page in the user interface. Now, once you've got your initial focus, your user will always have a next step. So the next step option should always be highlighted so that the user can start to very quickly see what's the most likely thing they're going to want to do and go ahead and do it without searching through a long list of different tools or options to have to get there. And in this we start to guide the navigation of the user. So I mentioned we want to be able to make our user's job easier. So if our user interface it can help them go through all the different steps that they need to with their process, then we've done our job right. So we've seen in the past, I think it was maybe Microsoft Word 2003 was it, when we met Clippy. So that was quite an annoying implementation for an experienced user of Word. But for a new user, that was really useful. He was there telling everybody where to get the buttons, what to press, how to do the different settings that they needed, change their fonts and things like that. But we can do it in much more of a simple way, and a much less obtrusive way as well, by maybe having pop-up toolbars for the first time a user enters the software. And then later on we could do it simply through a status bar at the very bottom of the screen, or again even just by highlighting different options. Now, another element of organization, and perhaps one that you may not have come across before, is consistency. Now, there's two main types of consistency, and the first one that I'll mention is internal. So internal consistency is all about how the different elements of your user interface relate to each other. So how similar are they? So we can see an example to demonstrate that here of, say, two different pop-up menus in the same user interface. Now, on the face of it, they look quite similar. They both have a title, 6 options, and then we can either hit OK or cancel our selection. But there's some very subtle changes here. One of them uses push buttons, the other radio buttons. One of them has them listed as item numbers, and the other one has text descriptions. So in this, we've become internally inconsistent. We've taken two very similar menus and changed the way that the user interprets the data or the information and interacts with it, which, although a very small difference in this case, starts to grow as you don't have this consistency within your user interface, which again is going to damage that fluid experience for your user, and it's also going to inhibit users from becoming proficient in your software. So the next example is external consistency. So external consistency is all about how your software fits into the world around it. So a really good first example of this is icons. So in software these days, we use a lot of icons to signify different actions and meanings. So if you take icons out of the real world, such as a stop sign or a traffic sign, everybody's going to know the meaning of that really quickly. In a very similar way, in LabVIEW, the run button, we know that that means play because it's the same as the play button on a Walkman. We know that it means we're going to make our code go. Same for the pause button. But it goes a bit deeper than iconography. So it also joins onto the flow of the program as well, and the way that you interact with it. So for example, again, to use the example of Office, all of the Office programs, and in LabVIEW, if you right-click on something, you're going to come up with a menu. You're going to come up with a properties menu or a shortcuts menu, where you can then interact with and change that object. And this is built into all Office programs and all the clones of Microsoft Office as well, right? So the same layout and the same functionalities are there in OpenOffice, Google Documents, all because they want to be externally consistent with what their users are familiar with to help, again, build up that proficiency. So the next concept of these three main building blocks is economy. So this is almost like when you've spent 3 months writing an essay for your university project, and then you need to spend another month cutting down those 30 pages to 20. So you need to really put some deliberation into what is actually worth showing to your user. And this builds into this simplicity. So you want to make sure that you're not confusing your user or bombarding them with different irrelevant information. So if we look at pieces of hardware, say we've got this audio mixer or maybe a boxed instrument like an RF effect signal analyzer. The traditional boxed instrument will have hard options, hard keys, and then soft keys as well. Now those hard keys, we can't make them go away. They're always there, even if they're irrelevant to the current stage in our process. But in software, we've got the luxury of making irrelevant options disappear, which again helps our users become proficient and helps them navigate our software more easily. So this also ties into clarity as well. But to make our user interface really clear, we want to make sure that we're getting rid of these very fancy graphics and things like that. It's just all confusing to the user to try and look at. We want a very clear and clean user interface. We want to make sure that the descriptions of options or objects are also kept concise as well, so that the user isn't bombarded with a wall of text. And then with our options in our user interface, we want to make sure that they're distinctive. So definitely in video games of the past, in things like Xbox and PlayStation, I remember user interfaces in games, they would, you're always controlling them with like the direction button, and then you maybe come to a menu where there's only 2 options. Now those 2 options may be highlighted something like green and the other one's yellow. And you ask yourself, okay, which one am I actually selecting here? It's hard to find out. So you want to make sure that your actual selection is distinct, But also you want to make sure that the actual options and the functions of the selections are mutually exclusive. You know, you want your user to be able to know exactly what's going to happen when they click button 1 over button 2. So the image here is the user interface. Simply looking at the layout of it has made it not very simple to view. Again, we've got these radio buttons where we could have actually just had the item descriptions on the push button themselves. And then again, it's more of a confusing layout because there's been less thought put into the actual structure of that menu. So the third building block of user interface theory is communication. So obviously this ties into one of the core functions of a user interface. Allows the user to interact, but also it's updating the user, right? So one of the things that we as users are very used to is immediate feedback. So again, to use the example of a text editor, when we highlight some text and change the font size, we want that to happen instantly. We want to know that our input has had a result. Now, in programming in LabVIEW, we're really used to that as well. So in the example of this image, we delete a sub-VI, straight away we can see that we've got broken wires and we lose our run hour breaks as well. Now, when we're developing software, we want to make sure that our users are updated on what they've done so that they don't get frustrated. There's nothing worse. The first thing you think every time is that you've crashed it, it's frozen. So we can do this with really simple things like loading bars, with LED updates, with a little status bar at the bottom. There's a lot of different techniques that you can use, but you just always want to make sure that there's some kind of feedback to a user so that they know that what they've done has had some impact. The next element of communication is prominence. So again, this ties into that navigation of options. We want to make sure that we have a prominent first step on any page of our user interface. And we also want to make sure that our second step is going to be prominent as well to help guide that user through the navigation. Now, one really good way of doing that is through the use of color. Now, color's not something that I see talked about very much outside of design circles. And I'm guessing most people in this room have degrees in engineering or science, or even we've just been programming for a long time. We've not done web design or graphic design at university. So I've done a little bit of research on color, and these are some of the tips that I've seen. So the first one of them is to add color last. So one thing that I see all over web design pages and forums is that your website or your user interface should work in grayscale before you go into adding color. So not only does this cater for people who are colorblind, it stops things from becoming a mishmash of different colors as you want to make different options prominent and exciting. Now, when we do come to add color, the easiest color to add is 1. So there's 2 main ways that you can add one color. One of them is to use grayscale with just one highlighting color. So does anyone recognize that color scheme, the top one? Does anyone know where that comes from? So this was the color palette used on the older version of the Netflix website. So another way to do it is just to adjust the hue and saturation of one color to bring you a sweep of different colors that you could use for maybe highlighting, low lighting, and maybe giving you a nice background color as well. So this one's actually a very close approximation of the Facebook website color scheme. Now, one thing to bear in mind, and we'll come to this point later, but specifically with color, we should use less. Less color is more color, otherwise you very quickly start to look like a website that was designed in the 1990s, or maybe even a MySpace page. And then if all else fails, copy. If your customer has a specific corporate color, use that. If you have seen a website, a magazine even, or some Android app user interface that has a really nice color scheme, steal it. Nobody's got copyrights on colors, well, some people do. But another really good way to start building up a color scheme is to use online tools. So I wanted to take a moment to show you one that I particularly like called Adobe Color Wheel. Has anyone seen this before, by the way, this tool? So this one's quite a good tool. Well, there we go. Let it load. Used by designers. So at the bottom we have our color palette that we've created. At the top we've got our color wheel. So who remembers that from art lessons in school? And then on the left-hand side we've got our color rules. So I'll put this to a more simple one. So I'll put that to shades. So what we've got here is a color wheel that we can build up our color palette with. So essentially I can take this icon and drag it around the color wheel to start creating a new color palette for myself. Now let's say I do have a customer with their own specific color scheme. Let me just zoom out this a little bit. There we go. So we've actually got hex and RGB. They're a little bit hard to see because of the resolution, but there's actually hex and RGB fields here, so I can type in my own color. Let's see if that actually goes. There we go. So I can type in a color. Let's say if my customer has their own specific corporate color, and then I can tweak my palette around that. So, oh dear, there we go. So this one was quite a simple color rule. So let's try a little bit more of a complex one. So we can take it even simpler if we want. Oh no, less simple, sorry. So we can actually then have control over 3 elements of our colors. So we can take our main highlighting color, have a darker low lighting color or text color even, and then have another lighter color for backgrounds. And we can just swing that around until we, let's say we wanted a blue one, we can take a nice blue palette very quickly. Now, another really good color rule to use is the complementary color rule. So does anyone remember about complementary colors from art schools? So you take a color on opposite sides of the color wheel, and colors on one side will make the colors on the other side stand out more. So if we tweak this a little bit, we can get somewhere that looks like, around about there, looks like the colors that we see on the NI website very easily. You don't see the yellow so much until you get deeper in it. But you can see that very quickly, just from a little bit of playing around, you can start to create an effective and unique color scheme that you can then use in your software. And there are other tools that I'd be happy to tell you about at the end. So having talked through some of that theory, we can summarize that really into 3 simple rules that you can bear in mind while you're actually developing these. So the first is to not reinvent the wheel. As engineers and scientists, we always want to innovate, right? We always want to make changes, we want to do something new. And that's really good, that's what we should be doing. But in user interface design, we want to make sure that we're never going to be doing something so new that it becomes confusing or hard work for our users. So if we take, for example, the car in the image, it's familiar enough that we know that we're looking at the driver's seat of the car. We know that there's a steering wheel. We can even see a power button in there as well, a little bit of external consistency so we can tell that that's how we're going to turn the car on. But then maybe, I don't see a handbrake there, but I'm sure I could probably work it out. I've got some of the main core elements of that car. I know it's a car, I could probably drive that, right? So it's a very innovative and unusual design, but they've kept enough of these familiar, old school almost elements that it's familiar to me as a brand new user to that. And then I did have a picture on the slide, but I thought it was more keeping to the message to get rid of it. So too much on the screen at once is distracting. We only want the information that's relevant at any given time. So taking it back to that traditional boxed instrument analogy, we want to get rid of all the options. We want to hide them out of the user's view for these settings that are only going to be used maybe even once while the program's open. And this enables our users to then focus on what's important. What's the routine that they're running on? What's the data that they need to make a decision with? What's the error or the alarm that's happened? And this is really going to help our users focus and do their job day to day. And the third is to keep our users in mind. So the first point of this is they don't know as much as you do. You've developed this software, you've developed this user interface. You're the expert. Now your user is going to know nowhere near as much as you do about this, so you're really going to need to hold their hand as they work through this software. So a few ways that we can help them. We can give clear instructions. Now this can be through the subtle ways of highlighting options and making them more prominent on the screen, or it could even be through pop-up messages, or we could bring our friend Clippy back as well. And then we also want to keep our users updated. We want to make sure that they know that all of their actions have had a consequence and that they're not going to get frustrated with our user interface, click around and maybe make things even worse for them. And then finally, we want to forgive mistakes. We want a control Z. We want to be able to undo things if we've done the wrong step in our process. And then the next thing to think about is how are they actually going to be using our user interface? So what's the screen size going to be? What's the environment going to be that they're using this in? Are they going to be in a dark room? Are they going to be outdoors with lots of glare? Is this going to be a touch screen? Is this going to be a minuscule screen on a tiny little panel? All of these factors are going to greatly change the way that you build your user interface to help that user. So having taken a look backwards and looked at some of the theory behind user interface design, I want to take a look at some of the changes that are happening these days and hopefully start thinking about some of the future of user interface design as well. So in this section, I want to show you some different concepts of the current trends in UI design, and then we'll have a look at a couple of very simple implementations in LabVIEW that are demonstrating these concepts. So the first of these is a big one, and it's one that there's, from previous times I've given this presentation, there's definitely mixed feelings about. And that's the flat UI style. So flat UI almost came about as a rebellion against the hyper-realistic graphics that we were starting to see, culminating in Windows 7, where we had the gel style of user interface, where we have all of these buttons almost look like a glass bead. And this kind of came about from screens having higher resolutions and our graphics processors becoming more powerful. We started seeing these very realistic user interfaces. Now, flat UI rebelled in that they said, hey, this is dumbing it down for everybody. We're tech savvy, we know what we're doing. And the whole theory of it is trying to be as simple and simplistic as possible, whilst also being very clear and communicative to the user. So there's very heavy use of iconography and color in flat UIs. But essentially it takes all of that 3D style graphics and makes it completely 2D. And we can see some examples of it here. That may look good to you, it may not, but it's definitely a trend that's happening at the moment, and we can see a good example of it in Windows 8. And more recently, we've started seeing this semi-flat user interface style, where we have these two-dimensional objects that exist in three-dimensional space, so they can float, they can move on top of each other. We'll have a look at those in a second. But now I want to show you a really quick demo of a flat UI that's for a touch screen. So this one's a really simple UI, right? We open it up, straight away we've got three options in our settings. So we've given our user that primary focus to aid their navigation. The first thing they need to do in this application is set up some sample rate settings and some number of sample settings for their data acquisition. So we can enter in our settings, so I might want 1000 and let's say 100 samples. I'll leave the save location. So what do I do next? So there's a little bit of external consistency here because we've got these three bars in the top left-hand corner. Now, in the Android operating system, these three bars have become synonymous with menus or options. So we've kind of given the user no choice here but to go to that menu. So we've guided their navigation. Now when I click on that, the menu bar swung out and we can then go, okay, well, I was on the settings pane, let's go to data. And then I can view the data tab, and then I go, okay, there's no other buttons on here, so my navigation's guided again. I can go to actions, and then again, a little bit more of external consistency through those icons. I know that here I can either save my data or exit the application. So the actual building blocks of this user interface are tab controls. So we've just got tabs here to go through the different pages of the UI. And then the settings was a separate tab that we moved across. So we'll look at the movement in a second. But first I want to show you how we actually created that UI, those buttons that we've got. Let's close that project. So we've got the same UI here, but with a more standard traditional LabVIEW menu button. So to create the menu button like we saw in the demonstration, in the project I can go to the controls folder, go to new, and then add a control. So in here, what I want to take is just any button, so I'll take a silver boolean and just take a blank button in this case. And then the trick to creating these is from here we can go into the customize mode. So we hit the spanner and it turns to tweezers. So from here I can now start to get into the really every single detail of this actual UI object. So let's just make it a little bit bigger on the screen. And then I can actually grab this bit that was the highlighting of the button image and just get rid of that, just deleted it. So the next thing to do is to right click on this button, and then you'll notice that there's an import from file option. So I can go to import from file, no idea why that's in system 32. And then I can take my icon that I want. So in here I've already prepared the actual button that I want, and you can see that I've got the other icons for the other buttons that I've used in my UI. So I'll take this menu white button, and then let's test it out. So I'll click it and, oh no, okay. So it's gone back into the old button view when I've clicked it. So let's go back into the customize mode, and when I right click, we can actually see that there's multiple different views for every object. So in this case, for the push button, we've got the deselected, the selected, then the changing to deselected, and the changing to selected views. So I just need to then go ahead and replace all of those. So let's go to selected. This is the boring bit now, so I'll just do this 4 times. Okay, so let's test that out. So now I've got my button that works in the same functionality that I want. You notice that it's allowed me to have a transparent background on that PNG file, so that I can then place this over any menu bar and have the same view. So I'll save that custom control. And then from my VI, I can simply right click on my old style menu button, go to replace and select a control. And then I can just take my new menu button, place that in. I think I need to tweak the size a little bit. When I jump into my app, I've got exactly the same functionality as I had before. So let's take a look at the movement of this next. So in the background of this, it's a very simple VI, but we're using this move.vi function here and taking some coordinates and taking the reference for the tab control. So let's go back into the presentation to have a look at what's happening inside there. So the move.vi, essentially we have a for loop and we've got some property nodes. So this for loop is going to iterate, and we've just set an arbitrary number of 16 iterations here. And in each iteration, we're going to move the object half of the way that we want to move it. So we have a desired position and a current position over at this end. So we have where we want it to be and where it is. And then over each iteration, we update that position by half of that difference. In doing this, we create a very fluid movement. If we were to do that linearly, it would look horrible. But this movement starts to create a very fluid and attractive experience for the users, and it's also very consistent with a lot of the user interfaces that they're used to on their mobile devices. So another big trend in the user interface world at the moment is material design. So Google published the material design guidelines, I think it was 2014 now, and this was for their latest version of Android at the time, guidelines for the application developers on how to be consistent with the rest of the Android ecosystem. So material design really set the specification for semi-flat user interfaces. It's all about these two-dimensional objects existing in three-dimensional space with different layers above them. And then they would move around and float above each other as the user interacts with the interface. Now, another key element of this is color as well. So they use lots of bright and vibrant colors to make sure that the UI is attractive, appealing, but also interesting to look at for the users. Now, everybody is either going to own an Android, Windows, or an Apple phone, and all of them are taking some of these concepts within those UIs. Now, previously when we were developing user interfaces, we were developing them for engineers using where all of their experience was coming from box instruments, from rack and stack instruments, from wires, cables, block diagrams. Whereas these days, almost everybody has a smartphone, so this is where we should be taking our external consistency from. So I want to show you another very simple demo, and this one's of a floating user interface. So this one's a floating application built to almost look like a Windows 8 or Windows 10 element. So this object doesn't have any pane around it. It's a very simple implementation of a clock at the moment. But if you had a UI, this could maybe be an alarm or a parameter that a user needs to keep an eye on, and you could keep this floating above the rest of their work. And then if it got in the way, you could simply take it and drag it and move it around. So this was something that I spent some time on, trying to get that movement to be fluid without actually having that Windows bar around it, which is usually quite a telltale sign that you've built a full application in LabVIEW when you've got the bar around it. So you can very quickly get rid of the Windows pane and then the menu, but the actual movement can then get quite hard to implement. So the actual indicator on this VI was done in exactly the same way as the previous demo I showed, only I replaced the background with a transparent .png image. And then the movement, let's take a look inside. Where's the VI? So essentially this whole thing is moving pane. So we take the boundaries of the front panel, we take the current mouse coordinates and the previous set of mouse coordinates, and then we move the UI that distance. And then this is iterating at a fairly constant rate, so that we get something like a 30 to 60 hertz refresh rate, almost matching modern screens, so we get this very fluid movement as we move the user interface around with the mouse. So it's a little bit messy, but it's a fairly simple implementation to overcome this problem, to then create a very unique looking UI. So we can see here that the specific property node we were using was the front panel bounds property, which allows us to take the coordinates of the actual edges of the front panel. So the next thing that I want to talk about is cards and tiles. So these again are specified in the material design guidelines by Google. Let's talk about cards first. So cards are a really good way to present related but different information. So we can see the example here of a stock market tracker app. So we can see in the top left, the most bold piece of information is the current stock market value for that company. Then we can see other related information, such as the day's change, the actual company that it is, and then a graph of the change over time. And then some user interactable objects to change the view of that graph. Now, if I wanted to then look for a different company, on an Android app, I could swipe across and I'd have the next tile for the next company laid out in exactly the same way. Now, I've seen something like this in one engineering application, which was presented, I think it was at NI Days last year, but I've not seen it in any others, but I'd really love to see something like this. Let's say you've got 10 different deployed monitoring systems, all monitoring the same set of related but different parameters. You could have a UI on say a tablet or a touchscreen so that your operator can go around and check as they survey the site what the current status of each of these systems is. Something I would love to see at the next NIWeek or NI Days. And then another implementation is tiles. So tiles present a set of homogeneous information, so the same information. So that could be a list of folders, a list of images, or a list of files, something like that. Now, tiles could be used in an engineering setting if, let's say, you had, again, distributed measurements, but this time they were all taking the same data. Or say you had runs of the same test and you have that same pass or fail result, or even that same specific value. Now, I don't have a demo of that, unfortunately. But the next element, and the final one I want to show you, is visual feedback. So we talked about this earlier, but more and more we're seeing a lot of movement in user interface designs these days. So away from the traditional loading bars and loading circles, we start seeing movement for menu items, for settings, for things like that, as we saw in the app that we looked at earlier. So using that move.vi that I've actually uploaded to the community as well on the NIWeek community, so you can all take that to play around with. You can create something like that menu option there on the right-hand side. Now, the reason why we want to create movement, firstly, we obviously want to update our user. We want to make sure that they know our app is still responsive and it's still working and that it's doing something, their action has had an effect. Now, it also gives a very fluid experience for our users, a very fun experience, and one that's going to give them pleasure as they use it. And then also, it shows how good of a programmer we are. It shows that our app is very quick and responsive. So again, we're showing off, but also it's mutually beneficial because they're going to enjoy it. So, two very quick demonstrations of ways to keep our users informed. And these are really simple, quick implementations to add into UIs. So the first of these is a progress bar. So this one's not even got a project, it's so easy. So this, on the front panel, is an array of color boxes. Now, if I hit run, I can straight away, I've updated my user, they know that it's loading something. Now, how long do I set this to go for? There we go. So if we take a look in the UI, it's simply an array constant, and then we rotate our one-dimensional array over a certain number of iterations. That's super simple, but you could have that anywhere in your UI, either on a specific loading window that opens up or in a status bar, and that's just very quickly going to show your user that your program is doing something after their interaction. Now the second one's even simpler, and possibly a little bit more on the beginner side than the intermediate side. But if I hit run on this application, then I've given myself a busy cursor, so really quick and easy. I've just told the user that it's currently doing something. If I take a look at that, there's actually sub-VIs built into LabVIEW to enable us to do that. We've got the setBusy.vi and the unsetBusy.vi. It's really simple, and that's all it is. So I was hoping to have a bit more of an exciting demo to end on, but hopefully because that one was so simple, it's something that you can all very easily implement if you haven't implemented something like that already in your software. But I wanted to end on some next steps for you all to carry on your journey into user interface design. So the first of them is join the NI community user interface group. There's loads of people on there who have uploaded their own custom UI toolkits that they've built that you can download and start implementing into your own software. There's also lots of discussion around UI design and what's best and how to implement different tips and tricks in LabVIEW. I've included a link to the demonstration VIs in the presentation, so it's in the NIWeek community. So you can download that Move VI and the Move Pane VI, so you can start doing these kind of things in your own software and have a play around with them. I've also included a link to Adobe Color Wheel to help you invent your own new color schemes. I've included a link to the white paper for custom controls. There's a lot more that you can do with them than I showed in my demo. And then finally, if you're really interested in material design, I've included the entire set of guidelines there as well, which is a really interesting read. Thank you very much, and then if anybody's got any questions or discussion points, I'm happy to open up to the room. Yeah?
It always seems to be that we or you or in general trying to recreate something that is not LabVIEW in LabVIEW.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that it's like a wasting precious time on recreating something that's already out there but on a different ecosystem in a way. Wouldn't it be easier to just build an interface and just use the Android SDK, for example, or just use a different interface altogether that fits better with modern design? Because I'm sorry to say that, but LabVIEW UI design is okay, you can make it work, but it's just not cutting edge.
Yeah, I think if you've got access to somebody trained in that, or if you yourself understand how to program for that, then definitely go that way and maybe interface that back with different LabVIEW applications. I think this was definitely about how to do it within LabVIEW. Outside of LabVIEW, there's a load of other options for UI design.
You have uploaded some images for the custom menu control, right?
So which section, sorry?
So in your demo,
Mm-hmm.
you have uploaded some custom images for the menu bar.
Oh yeah.
Did you create them by yourself, or is there a place online you can go download them?
Yeah, really quickly I created them myself. So you can use a free image editor such as GIMP, if that's one that you've heard of before. And then they are actually included in the files that I've got ready to download as well, including the transparent one.
For icons, one place that you can get a lot of them for free that are open to use is the actual Google Material Design page. It has a whole set of icons in black and white for just all of the icons in that. That's what I actually ended up
Oh, that's a really good one. Didn't actually see that, that's a good spot.
Kind of going back to his question, which you might not actually be able to answer this, but so is there any talk within NI of actually starting to support some of those, outside visual toolkits? Like I did see something before about HTML5 and about WPF. Is there any word on if those are actually going to ever get incorporated in LabVIEW, or is that kind of a dead end?
Well, definitely. So I think talking to this morning about how we want to have an open platform, we're trying to get more and more integration. So we saw the example of a Python integration toolkit coming in this morning. So I think the future's open. I personally haven't heard much talk about anything, but there's always possibilities.
That is an ongoing process within NI. I think tomorrow we may hear something.
Yeah, come to the keynote tomorrow.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Okay, I've counted 7. So yeah, thank you very much. You've been a great audience. And yeah, enjoy the rest of the conference. If anybody has anything they want to ask. And as you're making your way out, please remember to take the survey for the session as well.